Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. We have yet another horror game coming at us today, The Curse of Strahd. Based on the original Ravenloft by Tracy and Laura Hickman, The Curse of Strahd is the latest iteration of one of, if not the most popular D&D adventure of all time. This is high praise. The Curse of Strahd is a campaign, goes maybe 10, 11 levels long. Starts off with it takes the characters into a new land called Barovia. And Barovia doesn't really exist in Faerun or Greyhawk or any of the other kind of classic D&D settings. It is its own place. It's a kind of pocket dimension that looks like all the most horrific nightmare versions of Transylvania, Romania, that sort of area. It is a really popular adventure because it is unique in a lot of ways. Structurally, The Curse of Strahd does not take you from point A to point B. It's not about growing your character, gaining experience and levels until you're big enough to kill the dragon. It is about exploring this horrible place of Barovia and trying to survive. It is unique in that Strahd von Zarevich, the vampire that rules Barovia and that you are ultimately trying to defeat, he knows you're there the whole time. Barovia is not big, and he is going to spend a lot of time toying with you and taunting you. You can meet him several times over the course of the campaign, and if you ever step out of line, he is going to make you pay for it. One of the other great things about Strahd as a villain is that he's smart. He is relatively easy to defeat for 10th level characters who have the right equipment in a straightforward fight. But he is incredibly smart. One of the most intelligent and capable villains that a D&D group is ever likely to face. And so he will never face them in a fair fight. He will always come in with his spells prepared. He will call for backup. He will trick and lie, and he will do whatever he can to get away. That makes it often difficult for a game master to run this adventure because it is not linear, because it is not simple, because you have to think like Strahd in order to defeat the players. And if all you do is go from encounter to encounter and from combat to combat, it will be short and it will be disappointing. But if you are willing to give this the time and the forethought that it deserves, if you're willing to think like Strahd, then The Curse of Strahd can be one of the greatest D&D adventures you will ever play. It can totally live up to its reputation. So let's take a look. I don't have the PDF for this, but I do have the D&D Beyond book, and that's what we're going to look at right now. So what you see here in the table of contents, these are all descriptions of locations, right? And so it's not so much that you are traveling through a linear progression, but that Barovia, the land that he rules, is presented as kind of a sandbox. So here's a map of Barovia, and you know, most of the time you will start here on this road and you'll pass through these gates, and then you'll be stuck here. This is not a big place. There's a village here, there's a city over here, there's a couple of things, there's the castle right there, there's Ravenloft. It's not huge. And so you will be able to explore it in full. You'll be able to travel from place to place and kind of get to know things and talk to people and figure out what you need to do. There is a road leading out of it here and a road leading out of it over here, but the game won't let you go. Strahd rules this place, and he has been here for so long. One of the weird quirks of it is that most of the actual Barovians are born without souls. They are not real people, so to speak. They are kind of soulless husks of real people. And that is not enough to provide sustenance for Strahd. He needs actual souls to feed on. And he needs challenging opponents to keep himself from growing bored or stale with his eternal and tragic existence. So he tries to trick other people coming in. And in fact, there are 4 kind of suggested openings in the campaign book of how to get your players into Barovia. 3 of those 4 involve him, through his servants or through some other means, tricking people into coming in to Barovia so that he can toy with them, so that he can mess with them and enjoy himself that way. So really what this is a sandbox, that there are a lot of different options. There are some tools you can use that will help you to defeat Strahd. There are key bits of information you can learn. And so the campaign takes you around throughout Barovia, exploring these different locations, meeting the people who live there. Some of them are good, some of them are potential allies, many of them are outright villains or servants of Strahd who are trying to toy with you or kill you or simply spy on you for him. And as you go, you collect new bits of info, you collect new artifacts, until you think that finally you can defeat Strahd and free all of Barovia from his horrible rule. Now, in order to provide some structure to this, because it is such a wide open sandbox, they have done something that I find to be incredibly cool. They have this taroka deck. This is like a tarot deck. There are a group in here called the Vistani, who are very clearly modeled after like Roma travelers. And they have this tarot deck. And you don't need to buy a deck of actual cards, but I did because I'm running this campaign for some people. I wanted to buy the cards. So you've got all of this neat stuff in here. Huge cards. And so one of the very first things you will do, as you get trapped into Barovia, explore it a bit, and then you get to meet with one of these Vistani fortune tellers named Madame Ava, and she will do a taroka reading for you. And what that does is it tells you where to find 3 key artifacts, it tells you where to find an ally, and it tells you where to find Strahd himself when the time comes. He is going to find you probably multiple times before you're ready to fight him. But when you decide that you're powerful enough, that you've got enough things and enough backup that you want to take the fight to him, you know from your fortune telling which one of those spots he's actually going to be in. And so, there's all these neat little cards, and I don't know if the green screen's even going to let you see them, but there's a shepherd, there's a seer, there's a raven, and so on. And there's rules in the book for if you don't want to buy their taroka deck, you can just use a normal deck of cards. I think that the published cards are a lot of fun, but there you go. And that's going to give you some guidance. And it also gives the campaign some incredible replayability. You can play this with a different group, or even the same group a second time, and all of the stuff is going to be in different places. The key things that they need in order to feed him, like his tome and the holy symbol and the sunblade, you don't know where those are going to be. And so this fortune-telling card reading changes the adventure completely to a surprising degree, and that makes it a lot of fun. It helps you explore all of the places. It takes you around to key spots. Now, there's a lot of discussion online and in conventions between game masters who have differing opinions on how to do the fortune telling. One thing most, but not all, will agree on is that you should absolutely stack the deck as a game master. Or not so much that you should stack the deck, but that you should do the reading first, right? You do the little card reading for yourself in advance so that you know where all the important stuff is. And then, when the time comes for the players to do the card reading, perhaps many sessions later, then you have the deck stacked so that it comes out the same way. And the reason that a lot of people suggest you do that, myself included, is that by the time they get to the card reading, they may have already run into some of the people or places that show up in the card reading. And if you haven't done it in advance, then you might find yourself having to retcon things or having to go back or produce some confusing situation like that. Whereas if you do it in advance, even if you do it purely randomly, but in advance, then that lets you know right up front where everything's going to be, how this new iteration of Barovia is going to be laid out, and that will just give you a leg up on describing it to the players and helping it feel like a real place, and that this fortune telling is actually quote-unquote true rather than just, oh crap, this says the sword's in that house you already searched. You know? You don't want to run into that situation. That said, some game masters, myself included, might even suggest that you want to stack the deck a little more than that. Especially if you've run it once or twice, multiple times, you know which are the really interesting NPCs. And so maybe you want to pick one of those to for sure be the ally. Or maybe you have run through this and you know that one of the locations is really fascinating. And you want to make sure that they have good reason to go there, and so you can make sure that one of the artifacts shows up there. Or alternately, you just might really like the backstory of a character or a location or an item or something and decide that you want to incorporate that. If you really know what you're doing, you can even kind of stack the taroka deck such that people find the allies and the artifacts in the best order. Some of them, for example, the Sunblade, you want that to show up pretty late, because if you give very young, early characters the ability to create sunlight at will, that's going to hamper Strahd significantly. So you maybe want that to be one of the very last things they get that allows them to threaten him and decide to go beat him up. Whereas something like the journal, the tome of Strahd, you might want to give them that very early as an excuse to start feeding them backstory and getting them embedded into this really rich storytelling. So anyway, there's a lot of different ways to handle the taroka deck and the card reading, and just the fact that it is there and that it has so many options, I think, is one of the huge, coolest parts of the whole campaign. Plus, doing the actual card reading with your players is just an incredible set piece. There's no combat, there's not even a ton of role-playing necessarily, but every player is just glued to what's happening, and it becomes a really exciting, really fun thing that they're going to remember and talk about for a long time. So, it's a really fun part of the campaign. Now, what else is in the campaign? There's, it's dark. Let's talk about that. This is, there's one place where there is literally a mill where old witches are grinding children's bones to make their bread. Straight out of the old nursery rhyme fairy tale, right? And so, you gotta be prepared. This is a Gothic horror campaign to begin with, but you just need to know how Gothic it can get. There's not a lot of comedy in it. And I do think, as a game master, that adding some lightheartedness is actually a really good thing. Have some comic relief. Let the players laugh. Because then when the dark stuff hits, it will drop them from a much higher emotional height. down into this horrible pit to freak them out or scare them or whatever you're trying to do. If you spend the entire time at the same level of darkness, then adding more darkness doesn't really do anything. And so letting them feel hopeful or letting them laugh, letting them have fun, and then hitting them with some of the darker stuff that shows up in here can be really effective and can work really well. So don't be afraid of levity in your horror game. It can actually add a lot to it. That said, do be aware that it's dark. One nice thing about it is that while it is dark, they haven't gone what I would consider overboard, right? You absolutely could add in some splatterpunk, or you could cross some other kind of taboo lines depending on your group. Strahd is a vampire in the classic sense of, and given that he is in love with someone and he is trying to capture her and marry her and force her to love him. And there are ways that you could take that way too far for certain or even most role-playing groups. The campaign as written does not do that, which is great. And if your group wants to, then you've got the option. But don't be worried that the book is going to be full of like sexual slavery or rape or anything like that, because it's not. It's a Wizards of the Coast product. They have some pretty strict kind of content rules, and so you don't need to worry about that sort of thing. Anyway, one other thing that I wanted to point out about this while we've got the map pulled up is I have heard some game masters who suggest that you start over here instead, that you start on this kind of west end of the map and you come into this little town first instead of coming in to the village of Barovia first. I don't know about that. Personally, I've never done it. I can see a lot of value in it. This little town over here is happy. These people are protected. They have a wall around their place. They're very far away from Castle Ravenloft. And so there's definitely something to be said for the character arc of starting over here, where it's a relatively normal city, and then getting off into the rest of Barovia and realizing how dark and horrible everything else is. That said, I do think there's also something to be said for starting here in the actual village of Barovia, where everything is dark. It's a town that is falling apart. There's very few people left. They board up their windows at night. They live in abject horror. And starting there, and then eventually finding the wonderful oasis of that other city on the other side of the valley, that can also be really effective. Regardless of which part of Barovia you start in, the one big failing, in my opinion, of this iteration of the campaign is that it doesn't really have a really solid start. You've got, like I said, there are 4 hooks of how to bring people in. The one that uses the Vistani is the strongest one by far. But it still is basically just... It doesn't give you a lot to work with. And so I find myself having to do a lot of extra prep work in order to get this group of adventurers into Barovia. Part of the problem, of course, is that it starts as a level 1 thing. And so you will usually have, these are brand new characters. And it can feel strange, it can feel maybe even frustrating to create these characters and give them a backstory for wherever they actually live, Faerun or Eberron or whatever, and then immediately ignoring all of that backstory and pulling them into Barovia for the next 10 levels. It can be difficult to know exactly how to create characters and then how to get them into the story. One of the other problems is the village of Barovia includes a little mini campaign, little mini adventure kind of dungeon thing called Death House, which, as written, is a very sloggy kind of dungeon crawl that does not in any way establish proper expectations for what the rest of the adventure is going to be like. It is not a dungeon crawl kind of campaign. It's a campaign that is based on exploration, based on storytelling, based on Gothic horror, and so Death House is not a good introduction to it. Most of the story hooks are not an introduction to it. You know, 95% of this adventure campaign is wonderful, but that 5% that isn't is all right at the beginning. And so you might find yourself needing to do some extra work to get your characters ready, to get the story rolling, and then it all takes off and it's all fantastic. So, anyway, that is The Curse of Strahd. It is, like I said, one of, if not the very best, Dungeons & Dragons published campaign of all time. Written by Tracy and Laura Hickman, who are old school D&D royalty. And it's been in every version of the game since then. And this is the version for 5, and it really is phenomenally well done. It is a different flavor of adventure than most D&D players are used to. It's not the dungeon crawl, like I said. It's not hack and slash. It's not Lord of the Rings, let's go on a quest across this wasteland. It's all just in one little place, and it has this very Gothic horror feel to it. It's very different, very cool, and this version of it is fantastic. So, there you go. That is The Curse of Strahd. I am Dan Wells. Thank you very much for watching this video. You are awesome.